Welcome to part two of Elements and Principles of Design. So we talked about in part one, additive form. And right, there were three ways we could add form to each other. It could be edge to edge, it could be face to face, or it could be interlocking. So what we said about additive form was that it was sort of a nice, peaceful connection. Everybody was happy. The shapes really liked where they were. They felt relatively comfortable. Well, collisions of geometry is like additive form, except now I'm sort of throwing pieces together, seemingly, and just allowing them to be. So it's much more a collision. So if you were in a car accident, which I'm not wishing on anyone, but if you were to see a car accident or witness a car accident, two cars coming together, they collide, and there's this jumble of metal, right? So that's what is happening in collisions of geometry. So in this image, I'm just seeing these boxes that look just sort of stacked on each other in a haphazard way. There's a lot of angles. It doesn't look comfortable. It's tipping. So it feels like really they just fell, they collided, they stuck together, and it was just that. So there's a lot more tension that's happening, a lot more angular form. It doesn't look quite as peaceful as additive form. So again, a lot of irregular angles. So as you're walking through the spaces, they tend to create a lot more tension. And some would say they're a lot more interesting because it's unexpected what you're going to see around the corner. Excuse me. So next we have space defined by vertical elements. So we saw in part one lines to plane, so line to plane. So this is similar to that, except now I'm not just creating a plane, I'm now actually creating a space. So I'm starting to create a volume. So these vertical elements are creating a space that I can move in, around, and through. So this is Hagia Sophia, and we have these spires that are on all four corners, and they actually are truly defining the space for Hagia Sophia, and they're defining the airspace. So airplanes are not allowed to go within those, so they have to fly around it, and they're using these spires in order to define the airspace. So when I look at this image, I'm seeing that there are columns there, and there are columns at four corners, but the columns are really starting to create and define this seating area. So the seating area, even though it's outside, feels more cozy because it's within these four columns. So it's defining the space for the conversation. Degrees of enclosure. So I like this one a lot too. So degrees of enclosure are the bigness or smallness of a space. We'll say it that way. So this is actually, for me, the most descriptive image because I'm in this space, right? And it's probably, if the gentleman standing there is 6 feet, it's probably about 18 feet. So still relatively big, but it feels relatively closed in. It feels like I am sort of protected, as opposed to when I go to this space, it's very, very wide open. So I'm going from a very small degree of enclosure to a very large degree of enclosure. In a typical space, so this is a room, standard room that has windows, relatively small degree of enclosure. Even though this room is the same size, because they've opened the space up, it feels like a larger degree of enclosure. And then the final image, even more larger degree of enclosure because there are very little walls. So degrees of enclosure can have to do with actually physical space being opened up or the tightness or openness of a space. So the best example that I have of this, I went to the San Francisco Museum of Art. And so I was teaching at Cal State Long Beach, and I took a group of students on a field trip to San Francisco, a day trip. So I had to say it was a little stressful, like trying to get everybody on on a plane and off a plane and back on a plane and then on a bus and touring all of these different areas in San Francisco. One of the places that we went was the art museum. So the outside, if you've been there, it's an open courtyard like you would expect. And when you go in, there's a lobby, really loud, very echoey. And the main way to get up to the museum is through this staircase. And the staircase is striped black and white stone. And I'm like, really not liking this stair too much. Number one, because it was the black and white stripes, which sort of reminded me of prison, if you've ever watched the old prison movies. But also because the stair was very tight. And there were people that were jammed in trying to get up to the museum. And it felt slightly uncomfortable. But what I did notice is that I don't know if it was the people were so close together or because we're sort of working to get up the stairs, but it did get more quiet, right? So I went from this relatively big enclosure to this very tight enclosure. And then when you got up to the top of the stairs, it was a huge room filled with light. So totally opposite of what was happening in this really tight stairwell with no windows with these black and white stripes. So it really sort of brought you into a new space. And I was so sort of moved by it. Just the idea of going from this tight space to this large space, I looked it up. And the idea that the architect had behind it was that the stairwell was to act as a portal for you to sort of detox and wash off the day. So, you're in the courtyard, you're in the lobby, you got all the stuff going on, and walking up the stairs was meant to prepare you and sort of cleanse you so that you can get a fresh view, a new eye, in order to be able to absorb and take in the art. So very interesting. So again, designers really do have an idea of how they're using these elements in order to do what it is they want you to do or manipulate, right? So again, if I were to walk down this tunnel in this image, or these very two sort of walls that are relatively narrow, I'd feel pretty tight, right? But when I got to the end, it would be this big, expansive, open air view. So degrees of enclosure, going from very, very tight to very, very open. Again, if I'm coming down this hallway that's really tight, maybe 8 or 9 feet, has no windows, and then I walk into this space and it's open and beautiful, I'm getting a sense, I guess I'm appreciating more the expanse when I'm coming from someplace that's very tight. So this is also a museum, which I don't know which museum it is, but it feels very heavy, right? So again, degree of enclosure, I think the ceilings are relatively high. It's a big space, but because there are no windows, because it looks like these heavy rocks are on top of you, almost like you're underground, the degree of enclosure feels very, very small and tight and oppressive. So opening in a plane. So I love this one too. So opening in a plane is the idea that you're going to open up something special in a plane that will help you tell your story or get an idea. So when you say to me, well, aren't windows opening in planes? Yes, they are. It's a plane, there's a window or a door, but it's not special. So opening in a plane, you really want to be this special opening that talks about your design, that makes an impression on the person that's visiting it. So here's an example of a window, right, that's letting in light, but really they've made it a very special opening because they've put these slats up against the window and they're casting light onto this wall in a very unique and interesting way. So I'm sure a million light studies were done in this hallway, and I'm sure that you can probably actually almost tell time by how these lines are moving through this space. So really nicely done. Again, same here. So we have this perforated panel, and when the light comes through, it's actually putting light, casting light onto this wall. So it's making this hallway a really interesting thing to walk through. This is a nice one too, so I'm not sure what it means or what it's doing, but again, it is very purposeful in how they're opening up the space to let in windows. So yes, those are windows, but the shape and form are very unique, and I'm sure that the architect has a story of how and why that opens that way. I'm pretty sure this is a school, but it talks about taking flight, right? So there's a plane and it has these beautiful curved openings. So space within a space. So another one of my favorite design elements. So space within a space is when you have a fully whole contained space within another larger space. So most people want to say, well, four-poster bed is a space within a space. You are absolutely right. You can do a canopy bed, say it's a space, because if you wanted to put curtains around it, pull the curtains, and then you have your bedroom that's around it. So what I want to do is challenge you all to think above and beyond that, because that's sort of a typical space within a space. But I can start to look at things like this, right, that are pods for meetings or for dining, which are really true cool, right, spaces. So this is a space, this is a space, and this is the overall shell or the larger space that is containing them. And so in this current moment, we're seeing restaurants due to COVID uh, actually starting to utilize greenhouses. So I've seen greenhouses being put outside with seating for two, and dinner is being served through little portals, right? So if those started to happen inside, those would be little spaces within spaces. So we're seeing it happen more and more based on need, right? So that means the design is following the need. So here's another space within a space. So again, my overall shell looks like this large warehouse, but I have what is a conference room here and then something else going on here, which are spaces within that larger space. So this one is breaking the rules a little bit, because what I told you was that a space is fully enclosed in another fully enclosed space. So this one is not doing that, but I liked it anyway. I wanted to include it because it's very clear that this roof plane and this seating is acting as a contained space. It is very different than what's happening over here or what's happening over here on this side. It doesn't have four walls, but it's very clear that these things are connected. The ceiling and the floor are connected. So it's breaking some of the rules, but again, as we become designers and we become knowledgeable about the rules, it is perfectly wonderful and actually the best thing in the world to start breaking them, as long as you understand why. Here's another sort of cool space within a space. Spaces within spaces. You can tell this is my favorite one. I have a lot of slides. So now we have interlocking spaces. So we saw that happening in form, right? And so now this is more about organization. So as before with our form, we had our two things that came together, our additional additive form, and they interlocked, but it was really about the two things coming together. So in interlocking spaces, what we're now talking about really is the space that those two forms have created. So the new space that is actually the interlocked space. So when I look at this environment, obviously the public space is a very different function than this conferencing space or teaching space or whatever it is. And the hallway is what is interlocking them. So in this case, the public space ceiling goes all the way across, and the carpet from the private area comes all the way out. So this becomes the interlocking space. So it has a little bit of this one and a little bit of this one that helps connect the two. This one is also cool, right? So it kind of does the same thing. I'm not sure what's happening on either area, but in this one I have a wall that's going up wood, coming across the ceiling wood. On this side I have a blue wall that's coming across the floor blue and even up a bit into the seating. So it's connecting by interlocking. So again, for interlocking spaces, the thing that's important is the space itself. So it's a mixture of the two elements. So if I had an element over here that was red and an element over here that was blue, that interlocking space might turn purple. So spaces linked by common space. So in this case, it's not interlocking, but there's a whole new element that's being brought into play in order to connect the elements around it. So in this case, it looks like I have two buildings that are being designed, and the courtyard itself is going to connect the two, or maybe this is actually another building, a circular building that's going to connect the two. So I know this is a space linked by a common space because I see these two are the same and this one is different. This is a building in Cincinnati. So these two towers are connected by this bridge or this walkway. Here I have two parts of a house that are connected by a breezeway. And same here, I have two, it looks like large apartment buildings, but there's a walkway that connects them that has a pool, which is really cool. So scale and proportion. So you can't really talk about scale without proportion. So what I want you to do is cover up this gentleman with your hands. So we have that nice man fishing, right? And we could see very clearly, oh my gosh, that's a huge fish. But if you cover him up, what you're seeing is really just a fish, right? So you don't know if it's a close-up of a fish, if it's a large fish. You're not really sure what is going on in the picture. As soon as you remove your hand, you get perspective of the proportion and the scale. So you know that the fish in proportion to the guy is huge, so that you know the scale is not reality. It's sort of off. But I would not know that had the gentleman in the boat not been in the picture. So he's what we know to be true. He's our measuring factor. So this is the reason why, as designers, we put people in our spaces and our elevations so that it helps the viewer have a sense of how large things are. So this is that same museum we saw that felt really heavy and had a really small degree of enclosure. So we see how high those ceilings are, but because they are so heavy, they still seem really large, right? So we really didn't know how big that space was or how high those ceilings were until now we see this gentleman in the picture. And now we know the ceilings are really high, but the degree of enclosure still feels relatively tight because it's so massive. They are opening it up a bit because they have some light here, but think about if I go down this hallway. Tightens up again, right? So fortune cookie. We all know how big a fortune cookie is. Actually, I can hold it in one hand, break it, eat it, no big deal. We understand how big a fortune cookie is. But if I look at this image, I go, oh my word, that is a huge fortune cookie. Okay, so the idea that we know how big the city is makes me understand now how large the fortune cookie is. So scale and proportion. So modular. I think we talked about modular a bit in the grid and in the Getty. So the Getty is a modular plan. And so what modular means is that you're taking a unit and you're either multiplying or dividing that unit so that all the parts and pieces fit together. So this is, I can't see my mouse. So this is a square, right? And we'll start with this one because it looks relatively like a square, like all four sides are equal. But if I took this square and I divided it in half, I would probably get the top rectangle, right? If I took the top rectangle and the square, it's probably the size of the rectangle below. And if I took two of those squares, it's probably the size of the rectangle below that, okay? So all of these parts and pieces are components of itself, so it's modular. So I could very easily take all of the stuff and rework it. So if you remember the Eames house that I showed you, that was completely modular. So when they, I told you the story about how they lived on the land for a long time and then decided to completely redo the house. They had bought all the parts and pieces, but the plan that they had came up with for them no longer fit the site because they had been camping and living on the site with no house for so long. So they knew the views, they knew what they wanted to see. They took the exact same parts and pieces, and redesigned it using the same parts and pieces because they were all modular. They could fit together in different ways. Axis. So axis is this line right here. So axis is a measuring point. It's how we organize things. It's a line that typically is going to happen down the center, but the primary definition of axis is a line in which we measure. So axis is how I can determine if something is symmetrical or asymmetrical. So this red line is my axis. And if this image is symmetrical, I'll fold it and the two sides will match. If this is my axis and I fold the two sides and it doesn't match, then it is asymmetrical. But axis is the line that you are measuring from. So when I'm looking at spaces, I can determine their balance, whether it's symmetrical or asymmetrical, by imagining the axis. So if I'm imagining the axis here, I'm pretty sure that if I fold this, it's going to be very symmetrical for the most part, right? Because I always have a lamp on one side or something is going on. So not perfectly symmetrical, but in terms of the main pieces, it's a very symmetrical space. If I draw a line right down the center here, fold it, relatively symmetrical. As opposed to here, if I draw the line down, fold it, very different on both sides. And then here, if I fold it, again, very different on each side. So this is considered an asymmetrical balance. This one's asymmetrical, right? So even though the columns themselves are very symmetrical, if I draw the line here, when I fold it, the tables are balanced, but they are not identical. Hierarchy. So as designers, we typically in a space are trying to draw your attention towards something or away from something. And so one of the ways we do that is with hierarchy. And hierarchy usually means that you're making something in the environment different, and then that's what pulls the attention. So if I'm looking at this diagram, I'm probably going to say, or I'm for sure going to say that this square has hierarchy over the rest of the image, number one, because it's tilted, number two, because it has the circle in it, so it's different. When I look at this Bauhaus poster, what would you say has hierarchy in this poster? Hopefully you said the red square, right? Because it's the only thing that has color. So hierarchy in this case is this really tall tower, right? Because there's nothing that tall anywhere near it. So everything is relatively low lying. And then this tower sticks way above the city skyline. So it has hierarchy. I think this is a shoe manufacturing or shoe designing company. But when I look back beyond the glass walls, there's this orange box, right? And it has the shoes displayed on it. They are very obviously wanting you to see the shoe display because it's the only thing in this space that has any color. Also, I think it's pretty cool. It looks like it's a conference room. And so it's also a hub. So if you're new to the office and they say, meet me in the conference room, and you're like, where's the conference room? It's really easy to find and decipher. So color and hierarchy is also used in wayfinding. So if I were to say what has hierarchy in this image, you better say that purple chair. So it could be that this is the one really special piece of furniture that they have in their space. So everything else is neutral, aside from probably the books. But then this chair is this hot pink color. And it is a pretty famous chair. So maybe everything else is from IKEA, and this is their one piece of furniture. It's the womb chair. So in this case, everything is neutral, but what do you think has hierarchy? I would say the wood because it has texture. Everything else is very smooth. Everything else is cool grays or black and white, whereas the wood, even though it's a neutral because it's brown, it's a warmer neutral, and also it has the texture. Everything else is very straight, very clean, but they've chosen to use the circle cut of the wood. So it has hierarchy for a lot of reasons, because of the warmth, because of the texture, and also because of the shape. Rhythm and repetition. So I always feel like when I see this image, I need to go like guitar strings, because it feels like it's sort of making this movement, this flow. So rhythm and repetition really is helping to move people through space, to create sort of an organization, to create interest. So there are multiple types of rhythm and repetition that you can use. So you can just have straight repetition, like in this case where I'm seeing the three things that are exactly the same repeating. In this one, you can have alteration, where things are moving up and down, but they're the exact same image, but it's creating a little more interest and pattern. You can have progression, where you have items that are repeating, but maybe they're getting a little smaller, sort of like transformation of form. Or you can have contrast, where you have elements that are relatively the same size, but they are of different shapes or different colors, etc. So here is some repetition, which is just straight repetition. So again, I have my images in my frames that are very organized. I know exactly when the next one is coming. Here's repetition, but I have my lighting sort of changing heights to add interest. And it's just straight repetition here. And then datum. Love a datum. I think I probably already said that, but it's absolutely true. So datum is similar to axis in that it helps us organize things. So when you're planning, if you're designing a home and you're planning a wall, it's nice to have a datum where the doors align with the windows or the art aligns with the middle of the window, but there's some sort of organizing element. So you can organize around this datum however you see fit. So in this case, it looks like there's probably some other sort of datum happening that's curved. And so all of these elements are curving around this datum. In this case, everything is sort of moving straight and I have one thing overlapping, but this datum is the true sort of organizing point. So the most common ways that you're using datum in residential interiors is on walls and with hanging images, especially multiple images. So datums don't even have to be straight lines. They could be rectangles. So I could have a rectangle that's acting as my datum here. This one datum straight through. This one's a datum straight through, right? So this one is right, the datum is right in the center, whereas here it's falling on either side. So datums are really important. They help you look organized. So this is a really clean example of a datum, right? It's happening right down the center. And even though the pictures on top are not straight and aligned, I can see that this is what they are organized on the center line. So here could be a square that's happening, and the images are organized around that square. So one of the things I would suggest, especially if you're just starting out in interior design, and actually I recommend to anyone, is that you really got to test stuff out. So we haven't talked about paint selection yet, but it's really important because we have talked about lighting, that you really look and understand and see how things are going to look in a space. So if you're selecting paint or wallpaper, if there's the opportunity to get samples, even if you can't paint it on the wall, maybe paint it on the board, lean it against the wall, and really let it be and live with it for a couple days, because you're going to notice, as we talked about lighting, the color is going to change in the daytime to the nighttime. It's going to change whether it's raining, whether it's sunny outside. And so I actually had this experience with my living room that I really wanted it to be this mustard yellow, which is sort of a really typical Craftsman color. But my house has these big eaves, and no matter what I did, the color looked really bad in some part of the house. So it looked really great next to the windows, but as you got further in the house, it turned really brown. So I tried so many different colors of yellow. I really wanted it to work. I ended up with white because I was like, can't do it. So really you need to make sure that you can live with what it is you're doing. So when you're hanging pictures on the wall, you are, banging holes. So you want to avoid um, putting too many holes in your wall. So one of the things that is great to do is actually cut out the shapes of the frames and sort of tape and tack them on. Live with it for a little while. One of the things that you might notice is that once you start hanging images on the wall can get busy. So if you're dealing with someone who, has dizziness issues and you have these images going up the stair, it may cause them to feel a little off balance. So those are things that you want to understand up front before you move forward and make a permanent situation. So visual texture. So there are two types of texture in design. One is visual, one is real. So visual texture is that I really have a flat image. But when I start to look at the texture or look at the textile or wallpaper or whatever it starts to feel as if it's a texture. So it always starts with the motif. In this case, it's my zebra. And then it'll move into a pattern, right, which is regular rhythm and repetition. But then if it gets smaller and it becomes more random, then that texture or that motif starts to become texture. Even though it really doesn't have a feel to it, visually it becomes texture. And then we have real texture, which is something you can actually touch and feel, and either feel fuzzy or feel sticky or feel hard or feel soft. So I think this is a really cool wallpaper, sort of Art Deco inspired. Ends of wood, right? So this is really creating big texture. And then we can see we have our table lamp that's uplighting and wall grazing in order to highlight the texture. I love this room. I want to go there. I have no idea where it is, but to have all of these, they feel like leather strands all around you, makes you just kind of want to touch the wall. And these really cushy chairs that feel sort of triangular and spongy. So you can tell I'm a touchy person. I want to touch everything. I have been to restaurants with my family, and I'm like over here feeling the wallpaper while they're eating. They think she's weird. I'm like, no, I'm just doing my job. Okay, so in this case, bricks. So bricks have been pulled out of the building to create a pattern, but also texture. Texture on texture. So we have the stone, the slate, and then we have the wood, creating a contrast in texture. And then gravity. So you might ask yourself, why would anybody want to do this in interiors? And so there are really interesting spaces that use the idea of gravity as one of the design elements. So you're starting to make things feel as if they're falling. So really it's sort of like a transformation of form, except really it's in a downward movement. So the one architect I know that is pretty prevalent in this idea of gravity, he uses it often, is Eric Owen Moss. And really cool architect. He has a lot of buildings in Culver City. So if you decide to take color too, there's actually a field trip out there where we get to look and observe and take note on all of the buildings. And his philosophy is that one day you could be perfectly healthy walking down the street, the next day you get hit by a car, you're in a wheelchair. So life is very unpredictable, and that's what he's expressing in his architecture. So he uses a lot of this idea of gravity and things poking out and falling. So here's another one, and this building is based on the idea of plate tectonics, so things shifting and breaking apart. So he has the buildings on each side and the glass building that sort of represents the opening. And then this one is actually emphasized, this building idea of gravity is emphasized because it's actually on a street that's sloping. This one's about movement, so kind of gravity because it feels like it's melting into the ground, but it's a little happier. So this one feels like it's a little more whimsical. It could be dancing. So the idea of movement can also be used in interiors and architecture. So here's another movement. I do believe the concept for this one was water, so it's talking about the waves and the ripples. Movement, this could also be gravity. It feels like these buildings are sort of going in, falling into the courtyard. So I'm not sure I feel comfortable with that, right? I'm not sure I want to be there. But somebody is. But when we look at this, we see a lot of different elements, right? We see could be additive form or it could be collisions of geometry. Probably more collisions because they look like they're just stuck there and falling in. We see movement. We see a bunch of stuff. So again, what the design elements are really an alphabet. So each one of these is an A, B, C. And what you're going to learn to do through the course of this program is put them together into words, then into sentence. And then when you get to studio, it will become paragraphs. So what you are going to be doing for this project, we are moving away from house, and you are going to be creating some diagrams for me. So you are going to find some images that represent some of the key elements that we talked about. So in this case, you all know I love the Eames house, right? And so this is the case study house I was talking about that was all very modular, that they put together on a site after they had lived in it, lived on the site in a tent for almost a year. So in this is my picture that has no markup. And then what you're going to do is find the element or two, there may be more, and you're going to draw on top of it, preferably in the computer, and diagram it for me. So here's my point. You will write point and define it. And then there's my line, and you will write line and define it. So there's my line, there's my point. And then you're going to find another image that has something else in it. So this is grid. This is the image without any markup, and this is the image with the grid marked up. So you're going to do that, and the directions are in Canvas. I just wanted to give you an example and sort of talk you through it. This example is also in Canvas. So I hope you have fun. You look at a project, you're starting to see design differently through these little ideas and these elements. Talk to you later. Have a great day.